Well, alas. Okay, so welcome everyone that is here. This is now the Brinery, which is going to be for the rest of ever the location of Bright Nights, last Friday night of every month. And so this is going to be the new status quo. So for those of us joining virtually, they can't see it, but there's a whole cornucopia of different foods, and especially the Snickers bars, of which we have plenty now, thanks to the anonymous, generous donation of whoever it was that gave us a yard worth of Snickers. And that was exciting, unexpected, and delightful in equal proportion. Yes, tonight we're going to be doing, again, I think this is maybe the third or fourth installation of a presentation during the Right Night. An evolution of the original intent of just people getting together and co-working, and now making it a little bit more intentional and directed. And then after this, we will divulge into co-working spaces and be able to write or whatever. And perhaps I could then take the time to actually write the speech, which is what I was supposed to have done and did not do. So we are now going to do something very similar to one of my favorite authors and thinkers, Baudrillard, who is very famous for the idea of simulacra and essentially simulated reality and so on. And his most famous topic, or one of his most famous works, is the Gulf War did not take place. And so basically the thrust of that argument is to say that, yes, there was a series of events that took place in Iraq in the early 90s, and there was fighting and so on. But the idea that everyone has of the Iraq or the Gulf War is very concrete and is mediated through the media representation of that conflict. And it is totally distinct, separate, and in many ways a false representation of what actually occurred. So, to draw out this idea of simulated reality and the filters in which we receive information. And so, in other words, I've spent maybe the last 2.5 minutes droning on about why the speech that I wrote did not take place. Regardless, to dive into the unwritten speech, tonight's topic is on seriousness and silliness. And it is the juxtaposition of the two, to what degree they are relatable or complementary, and to what degree they are pure opposites. And this is kind of inspired by an article that Mara and I were introduced to through different sources. I saw it on a news aggregation site, and I think you got it through an email like news aggregator. Either way, the name of the article is "It's Time to Get Serious" by Catherine Boyle, and it was published on the Free Press, I think was its home site, but many places linked to it. And so this author apparently is now kind of like a venture capitalist of some sorts, had at one point been a writer for the Washington Post, and this is the background for what she's hypothesizing here, saying that essentially the malaise that we are all kind of peripherally or explicitly aware of in our country it currently can be rooted in a lack of seriousness in the zeitgeist of our country and of our culture. She states in so many words that we are too used to being essentially infantilized, at least in the younger generations, in specifically American culture and society, but more generally in the West, and even in many other countries and cultures outside of the West, so to speak. And so she's saying that we find ourselves in this malaise because we are too busy with things like TikTok and all of these things as kind of like epiphenomenal manifestations of escapism, and not actually grabbing life by the horns or taking these exciting, thrilling, and risky leaps into innovation or what have you. That takes a strong will essentially to make these necessary changes to keep society healthy and vigorous and alive. So a quote from her, another thing that she teases out is that the world is now run by essentially geriatric leaders. So you have octogenarians and septuagenarians that are all in charge and have been for decades. Case in point being like, Biden, Trump, both like 70 plus. And that, the parties are all controlled by people way, way advanced in years. And that not only in politics, but you see this in corporations as well, that new CEO turnover is at historic lows, that people get into a position, park themselves, and stay there. And there's not this turnover that there had been for all of time, right? Partly because people just died of things like, a strep throat back in the day, and then, you couldn't run a country for very long because you just died of now curable illness. Or because there was just such competition and societal norms that people in power would just give it up willingly, whereas now that's not the case. So she says, the tens of millions of Americans that are like me, millennials, or members of the generation just younger, Gen Z, have been treated as hapless children our entire lives. We have been coded as young in business, in politics, and in culture, all of which is why we shouldn't be surprised when millennials are the most childless and least home-owning generation in modern American history. One can't play house with a spouse or have their own children when they move back into their moms, as 17% of millennials have. And so later on in the article, she says, the boomer ascendancy in America and in industrialized nations has left us with a global gerontocracy and a languishing generation waiting in the wings, and constantly makes refrains to delayed adulthood. So all of this was, something that Mara and I had talked about and was kind of, cooking inside my mind of what is she getting at? Is there any validity to this? Because my first reaction was when I had been experiencing at work kind of like minor burnout symptoms of just being like, oh, well, I want to do this thing for my career, and after I'm done with training, but it seems so hard to be able to make this come about. And there's so many people set in their ways, and they don't want to allow this position for cancer pain to occur, and it's just been very difficult for me to do. So partly that, and then partly because I had been talking about memes and all of these things, as I want to do from time to time, and how memes themselves are kind of, humor that is almost on some level nihilistic, at least predominantly in many of the memes and tropes. And so you have these frustrations with, the rigid order that we experience, and its malaise, and then also fresh on my mind was this kind of nihilism that's permeating younger generations, especially as expressed in memes. So reading this, I started to think, oh my gosh, she's on to something. Like maybe seriousness is what's needed to reinvigorate our society, to allow us to have more meaningful, social relationships or more meaningful societal advances and so on. But then thinking more on what the thrust of her argument was this idea that we had to essentially express in an effective way our wills. It became very Nietzschean in some sense, and almost like progress for progress's sake. So its own form of nihilism that it finds in it the solution of the will reified or made manifest in the world. And so that too to me seemed empty and devoid of a more lasting and more deep solution. So it seemed that this, we all kind of intuitively grasp that we're in tumultuous times, or at least kind of in the precipice of that things seem much different than they were in the 90s or even in the 2000s. But her solution was, let's double down on American pull yourself up by the bootstraps, ingenuity of the mid-20th century. And kind of makes a broader case that she doesn't actually flesh out of we need to just be more serious people. And so that led me into thinking, well, how do we grapple with that? How do we combine that with our faith with living a virtuous life, and what examples do we have either to the contrary or that might go beyond this. And so, I think to set all of this up, the article in my mind was creating a juxtaposition between this kind of like nihilistic, absurdism that predominates kind of the at least the zeitgeist online, versus this, very dedicated, very production-driven, looking for end products and building things and all of that mindset. And so, all of this at the end of the day seemed too materialistic. And so I wanted to pivot into where more nuance could be occurring. And so part of that is, transitions into T.S. Eliot, who's one of my favorite poets. And so in his 4 quartets, which I highly recommend to everybody, I mean, I think they're fairly cheap at this point, but I've got like a paperback book that I picked up in a college club for free, which is great. And it's like 100 or maybe 70 pages, but it's poetry, so of course it reads much faster if you really wanted to power through it, or much slower if you wanted to savor it. And the 4 quartets are 4 different, very long form poems that are brilliant and get into time, the passage of time, the paradox of time, and God and man's relationship to God and himself in the context of time. But I'll read a passage to begin with, and then kind of skip ahead into the pivot point in this speech over to the subsequent thoughts that I've alluded to earlier. So this is from Burnt Norton, which is one of those long-form poems that T.S. Eliot wrote. So time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility, only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. And then skipping ahead. Go, 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 said the bird. Mankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present. And it's that humankind cannot bear very much reality that comes into mind here. I think in the broader context of the entire collection of poems, in my mind, this is relating to both our own mortality and our death and our realization of a world without us on some level, and the finitude, or the end of our time on Earth. But even more so, I think, to the fact that we cannot bear just the plainness of the reality that we have. We know that there's something different, and that to settle for just what we can take in with our senses, we know that we're missing something, which is God. That we live in a sacramental world where all of these things are kind of pointing towards that one end, which is always present, which is God, right? So that if we get too bogged down into these kind of epiphenomenal manifestations of the underlying grace and glory that is God, that we can get caught up in ourselves and collapse under the weight of this reality, so to speak. And I think that this is kind of what that piece was doing, and what it's kind of alluding to beyond its own scope, which is this struggle between chaos and absurdity and nihilism, and one's own will and pursuit of perfection and pursuit of production and pursuit of something new. And so this is a completely false dichotomy, that there's something that we're missing and that it's deeper and that is God. And furthermore, we all know that there are times, this is not meant as some sort of condemnation of seriousness, nor some glorification of silliness per se as its juxtaposition, or the inverse, right? Not a condemnation of silliness and a glorification of seriousness. And I think that the balance here comes from Ecclesiastes 3, right? So the intro to that is as follows. There's an appointed time for everything, and a time for every affair under the heavens, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot the plant, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to be far from embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. That in its own sense, you can have one, feeling or one particular persuasion predominate in understanding that there is what is virtue, to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. So in a similar way, both of these things can be used virtuously, and that there needs to be a balance of the two. In some ways, perhaps, to reapply it to the issue that was first posed by this author at the beginning of the presentation, maybe there are pendulum swings that are occurring, and we're trying to see in the best interpretation our society trying to work itself out. That we had a very serious time with World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and so on, and now that these wars are and then even Afghanistan. And as these are kind of waning, you see this attempt to escape from this reality. And it's being done in a very, unfortunately, atheistic and nihilistic way, but it's still a natural human impulse, because there is nothing new under the sun, right? And so I think while, yes, there are times for discrete quanta of seriousness and silliness, right, at times for these things, there's also a good synthesis of this, and where I'd like to leave the presentation. And that's in St. Philip Neri, right, who is well known perhaps by many. He was a priest that was in Rome, and he was very much a Roman. He played in the streets games as a kid there when he grew up, became a priest, and was very well connected for reasons that will become clear, but with cardinals, with the popes, and was offered to become a cardinal several times, to which he would not allow himself to do for fear that it would make him, too haughty. And so he rejected it several times, including when a pope literally took his old cardinal hat and put it on St. Philip Neri, who basically ran away. And St. Philip Neri is kind of a clown in many ways, and he wanted to be. He was a fool for God. So to read a couple of things about what he did and how he acted. This very saintly man who would go to the catacombs by himself and pray, and had a very robust, profound, serious spiritual life, and had mysticism with ecstasy when he was in the catacombs by himself offering up Mass, and then the Holy Spirit came into his mouth and then into his heart, and his heart grew and broke his ribs, so he has broken ribs in his skeleton. So he is an incredibly holy man, who would also, be around people at Roman society's fringes, like the cripple, the children that were kind of abandoned or orphaned, Jewish folks, which at the time especially that was a big, deal. So he was living the gospel, very holy in his own practices. But he also engaged in ludicrous pranks, read joke books, and played the clown in general. His sanctity was so noticed that he had to spend most of his time trying to tear down his own reputation in people's eyes. His joviality prevented people from discovering how holy he was. And he even turned down his own sense of God so that he could get through his external religious duties. He walked around in large white shoes, dressed in bizarre get-ups whenever he thought he would meet any of the cardinals, wore all his clothes turned inside out, often wore a fur cloak through the streets of Rome to make people think he was vain, carried a pack of brooms and stopped every once in a while to smell them as if they were scented flowers, shaved his beard on only one side, and he had a huge beard, wore his beretta cocked sideways, and wanted to be a fool for Christ. St. Philip Neri himself even said, "A cheerful and glad spirit attains to perfection much more readily than a melancholy spirit." So he was a jovial saint, one who was able to both walk the walk and combine that in every moment with taking life not too seriously, but doing so for the sake of Christ and his mission, and was an incredibly effective evangelist, to the point where when the devil's advocate for him in the canonization process was saying there's no way that this man could be a saint. He was trying to corrupt the youth, in fact, because he would curse in front of them in ways that were meant to try to get them to laugh and so on, because he was a priest, and how could he? And when he was alive, they said that this was proof positive that this man cannot and ought not to be a saint, canonized. And so there was an apparition of him to the whole gathered council where he was just sticking out his tongue and doing something like that, or whatever the cultural equivalent was in Italy, and then disappeared. And then at that point, they just stopped the process and then made him a saint immediately. And so, it's like very apropos. So I think St. Philip Neri is the key, the crux, and the way to synthesize what is silliness, what is seriousness, what are these impulses that we have that we see in our culture, and we have an example that Christ, through his grace, has given us to be able to synthesize and have in a tangible way. So I think that you can have both, that there are times for each one in its own discrete way, but there's also a time to synthesize the two, a la St. Philip Neri. And that is my presentation on silliness and seriousness. And what I actually wrote for this was when I was presented this topic too, and then ... And then, so anyway, sorry. Next time I'll be more prepared.